Okay, we're talking to Shruti, Shukla of WWF India, and Simon from Bournemouth. Thank you, Simon. I tend to ask questions that are too long, so here's a nice brief one, for which I'm very grateful, and to the point. What will be the impact on animal species? I think this is picking up on forestry, obviously.
The IPCC report, I won't go into short forms. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a coalition of scientists across the world, has come out with some analysis on this, and depending on how far you allow global temperatures to rise, there will be varying degrees of impact on animals and species. If you rise somewhere between, global average temperatures rise somewhere between 2 to 3 degrees, you're close to losing 30% of your species as you know them today. And that, to my mind, is a huge loss, because we will not be able to replace it at any given point in the future.
We've got another one we hit a nerve here. Forests obviously matter to people. Or Melanie from, I'm not quite sure, Bournemouth, I think. Bournemouth, Melanie. Sorry if I can't get your domicile right. Are countries prepared to offer incentives to countries such as Indonesia not to deforest?
I think there is some very positive response from industrialized countries on the proposal on the table on deforestation, and even within the developing countries there is a strong support on this issue. So I think countries are prepared.
Sure. Well, that's positive. Is it likely to be a controversial issue, to be one of the stickier ones to be negotiated, or do you think it's just one of many issues?
I would ask you to explain stickier to me, but like with everything, because this is a process driven by consensus, so it will be discussed and discussed extensively. But I think this process is pretty concrete, and we should be seeing results on this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll leave sticky for the moment. Sorry. Tony in UK. Now, this is broadening out a bit here. What will happen to developed countries if they don't reach their targets? Is there a sanction?
Now, that question can be interpreted in two ways. There can be a legal response to it, and there can be kind of impact would there be seen. I mean, everybody across the world will be impacted. So if developed countries fail to reach their targets, they're basically putting the fate of close to 5 billion people in the balance, and that, I think, is not an acceptable outcome. And in terms of what it could legally mean, I think there is a compliance mechanism within the protocol which looks at what countries would have to face in terms if they fail to meet their targets. But I think the imperative here is that we need to understand the impact. These impacts, in this case, there will not be any national boundaries which will stop these impacts. They will be across the planet, and we need to keep that in mind. And I think I've answered your questions both.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good answer. Just to make it clear, though, if they don't reach their targets, I mean, as well as obvious moral responsibility and possibly some sort of legal, quasi-legal responsibility, would it jeopardize the whole attempt to negotiate an international agreement to act? Would developing countries say, well, if you're not going to cut your emissions as you promised, why should we bother to do anything?
I say that the Kyoto Protocol is about industrialized countries cutting their emissions, and there is no if and but attached to that. It's about them cutting their emissions for simple reasons of historical responsibility. And I know it sounds a little cliche, but unfortunately the problem that we face today is basically because of the emissions which have been done in the last 150 years. And you need to take responsibility for that. And developing countries are willing to work on it, as far as my understanding goes, because the really poor and vulnerable countries are very worried about the fact that their people will be impacted beyond, they do not have the capacity to be able to adapt to the kind of impacts we potentially could face if nobody did anything.
Yes.
And so, work on that.
We certainly do. Okay, this is Shruti Shukla of WWF India, Coordinator Energy and Climate Policy for WWF in India. She's talking to One Climate Second Life happening at Bali, and the questions are coming in. Simon from UK, is it ultimately for nations or UN bodies to decide on a post-Kyoto agreement?
The UN bodies are just a representative forum of the nations of the world. So at the end of it, it's the nations which decide in a collective manner about the outcome of the post-2012 discussions that we have here.
I think that this may be incorrect, but I mean there is a sort of a slight misunderstanding about the United Nations sometimes, where people see it as a separate entity on its own, but it is run by governments, and so it doesn't have an independent life. If it's doing something governments decide they don't like, it will just tell it not to do it anymore. Perhaps I'm not sure, I'm trying to interpret the question, which may be unfair. When he says UN bodies, perhaps there's a suggestion that some of the UN agencies, such as the United Nations Environment Programme or whatever they are, maybe take on a sort of a slightly independent life of their own. Perhaps that's what's behind the question.
In most cases, whether it's the United Nations Environment Programme or it's United Nations Development Programme, these are implementing bodies of the decisions taken within a forum which has members or representatives from sovereign nations. So in effect, it is actually executing the will of those nations.
I'm going to switch the topic for a moment because there's a lull in the questions, so I can get in one of mine, which is a little luxury I have. Somebody today, I think it was, I hope for Martin's sake, of my sake, it was Martin Kaur of Third World Network, another activist group based in Malaysia, who said that the South is facing 3 development disasters. The current one, by which I think he means just development today, too many people who are too poor and not well, with no access to facilities. The one caused by climate change that's coming, or is beginning to arrive, and a disaster, this is quoting Martin Kaur, that could be caused by the solutions agreed to in order to address climate change. I'm going to ask your comment on it. I think what he means is, at the danger of putting words into his mouth, that the solutions might be worse than the problems in some of these areas. If powerful countries influence the agenda, maybe that they won't be solutions of benefit to poor people in developing countries. And I wondered whether you felt that was a danger.
I come from a country which is the world's largest functional democracy. So, as with all democracies, I think this forum is a very democratic forum. Everybody has the option of exercising their opinion and stating it publicly, and we have to respect that. Having said that, I would say that probably Martin has his reasons for saying this. I would have to talk to him to be able to comment on it, but as far as the development challenge goes, I do not deny the fact that there is an immense development challenge that we have on our hands, and I've said it earlier as well. All our investments which we've thrown into development over the past 70 years will be at risk if we do not take timely action on climate.